I still remember the exact moment my life fell apart. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 9:17, not 9:15, not 9:20. I know the time because the digital clock in the executive conference room was the last normal thing I saw before everything changed. If someone had told me that by the end of that meeting I'd be accused of stealing $12 million, escorted out of the building by security, and become the most hated man in a company I'd helped build for nearly 12 years, I would have laughed. Because I had done nothing wrong, or at least that's what I believed. What I didn't know was that someone had spent months preparing to destroy me, and what they didn't know was that for the previous 2 years, I had quietly recorded every executive meeting I'd ever attended. Those recordings would eventually cost a billionaire everything, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why my former CEO ended up begging me for mercy in federal court, you need to understand how someone becomes the perfect scapegoat. And trust me, it didn't happen overnight. My name is Daniel Carter. When this story began, I was 41 years old, married, with one daughter heading toward college, a mortgage that kept me awake some nights, and a career I honestly thought would carry me to retirement. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't one of those executives who drove a Lamborghini or posted pictures of private jets on social media. I drove a 6-year-old SUV, packed my own lunch most days, left work early enough to have dinner with my family whenever I could. People trusted me. Actually, that was the problem. Everyone trusted me. I was Chief Operations Officer at Harlow Dynamics, a rapidly growing technology company specializing in cybersecurity software for hospitals and government agencies. By the time I joined, we had fewer than 60 employees. By the time this story started, we had nearly 3,000. I knew almost everyone who'd been there from the beginning. I'd interviewed dozens of managers personally. I'd celebrated weddings, sent flowers after funerals, helped employees through layoffs during the pandemic by taking a pay cut myself. People remembered things like that, which is exactly why I became useful. Useful people make excellent sacrifices, but I didn't see it then, not even close. Our CEO, Richard Harlow, was the kind of man business magazines loved. Charismatic, confident, always smiling for cameras. He could walk into a room full of investors and convince them the sky was green. Employees admired him, reporters adored him. The board practically worshipped him. If Richard told you tomorrow would be sunny while you were standing in a thunderstorm, half the room would still believe him. I admired him too, for years, until little things started bothering me. Tiny inconsistencies, nothing dramatic, nothing you'd quit over, just enough to make me wonder. Like how every quarter, expenses somehow climbed while profits looked cleaner than expected, or why vendors we'd never worked with suddenly received million-dollar contracts without competitive bids. Whenever I asked questions, Richard always had answers. Fast answers. Too fast. Strategic partnerships. Temporary accounting adjustments. Complicated tax structures. He always made it sound like I simply wasn't seeing the bigger picture. Maybe I wasn't. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The first real warning came 18 months before I was fired. Our longtime chief financial officer retired unexpectedly. Officially, it was for health reasons. Unofficially, he looked terrified during his farewell speech. I noticed because I'd known Mark Benson for 11 years. Mark wasn't emotional. I'd seen him negotiate hostile acquisitions without raising his heartbeat. But during his retirement party, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. When everyone else left the restaurant, he asked if we could talk privately. We walked to the parking lot. He looked around before speaking. "Daniel." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Be careful." I laughed. "About what?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He stared toward the building for several seconds. Finally, he said something that didn't make sense until much later. "When good people suddenly become inconvenient, they usually disappear first." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He forced a smile. "It means enjoy your family." Then he got into his car and drove away. That was the last conversation I ever had with him. 3 months later, he was dead. Official cause? Heart attack, age 58. Everyone moved on, except me, because I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd almost said. His replacement arrived from New York, Evelyn Cross, 45, Harvard MBA, former investment banker, brilliant, efficient, cold. Within 2 weeks, she reorganized the finance department. Within a month, people who'd worked there for years started resigning. No arguments, no dramatic exits. They simply disappeared, one after another. Every time I asked why another experienced employee had left, the answers sounded rehearsed. They wanted new opportunities. Funny. Apparently, dozens of people wanted new opportunities at exactly the same time. Still, I stayed focused on operations, production, clients, deadlines, the areas I could control, because sometimes ignorance feels safer than curiosity. That illusion didn't last long. One Friday afternoon, my assistant walked into my office carrying a thick folder. "Legal wants your signature." I looked up from my laptop. "For what?" She shrugged. "New vendor authorization." I flipped through the paperwork. Halfway down the second page, something caught my eye. A consulting agreement worth $8.4 million. I'd never heard of the company. No prior meetings, no operational review, no procurement documentation, nothing. I called procurement. They'd never heard of the vendor either. That should have been impossible. I walked directly to Evelyn's office. She smiled before I even spoke. "I was expecting you." I held up the contract. "Who approved this?" She answered without hesitation. "Richard." "Based on what evaluation?" "Executive discretion." "There isn't any supporting documentation." "There doesn't need to be." I stared at her. $8 million doesn't need documentation? She folded her hands. "Not when the CEO signs personally." Something about her tone bothered me. She wasn't explaining, she was warning me. I left without signing. That decision would later become one of the biggest mistakes and one of the smartest decisions of my entire life. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the contract, so I did something I'd never done before. I checked public business records. The consulting company had been incorporated only 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks. No employees listed, no office, just a mailing address. Then I checked the registered agent. The name meant nothing to me, until I searched LinkedIn. One connection appeared, Richard Harlow. Not publicly, but through a private nonprofit board they'd both served on years earlier. Interesting. Not proof, just interesting. I closed my laptop, told myself I was overthinking everything, went upstairs, helped my daughter study for her chemistry exam, watched a movie with my wife, pretended life was perfectly normal. Sometimes denial is incredibly comfortable, until reality kicks the front door open. Monday morning started with applause. Richard announced we'd secured the largest government cybersecurity contract in company history. Everyone cheered. Champagne appeared. Bonuses were promised. The energy was electric. Then Richard called me aside. His smile never faded. "Daniel, we need to talk." We stepped into his office. He closed the door. "I heard you refused to sign Evelyn's paperwork." "I wanted documentation." He leaned against his desk. "You trust me, don't you?" That question felt strange, because trust doesn't usually need to be requested. "I trust facts." His smile became thinner. "Sometimes leadership requires faith." I wasn't hired for faith. I was hired to manage risk. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed, clapped me on the shoulder. "That's why you're valuable." I smiled politely, but something inside me whispered, "No, that's not why." And for the first time in years, I walked out of Richard Harlow's office feeling like I'd just failed a test without knowing the questions. I had no idea that conversation had already sealed my fate, because while I was worrying about one suspicious contract, someone else had quietly begun creating an entirely different story. A story where I wasn't the executive asking uncomfortable questions. I was the criminal. And somewhere inside the building, the first piece of evidence against me had already been planted. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't dramatic. No anonymous threat, no mysterious phone call, no masked stranger waiting outside my house. It was something much smaller. Someone stopped saying good morning. That may sound insignificant, but when you've worked in the same building for over a decade, routines matter. The receptionist who had greeted me every morning suddenly avoided eye contact. Two managers ended a conversation the second I walked into the hallway. An engineer I'd mentored for 5 years looked like he wanted to say something, then quickly walked away. At first, I blamed stress, deadlines, corporate politics. People get weird when big government contracts are involved. But by the end of the week, the silence had become impossible to ignore. It felt like I had entered a room after everyone had been warned not to trust me. The strangest part? No one had actually accused me of anything. Not yet. Which meant rumors were spreading before I even knew there was a story. And rumors don't appear out of nowhere. Someone creates them. Wednesday afternoon, I received an email marked confidential. The sender wasn't Richard. It wasn't Evelyn. It came from internal audit. Subject line, mandatory review meeting. No explanation, just a conference room number and a time. Thursday, 8 a.m. I almost ignored it. Internal audits happened all the time. Routine compliance checks, nothing unusual. Still, something about that email made my stomach tighten. Maybe it was because it arrived only minutes after Richard canceled our weekly strategy meeting without explanation. Or maybe it was because, deep down, I already knew the ground beneath me was starting to crack. The conference room was already full when I arrived. 3 people from internal audit, 2 attorneys from legal, Evelyn, Richard, and a man I'd never met before. Gray suit, federal-looking haircut, no smile, no introduction. Richard stood as I entered. "Daniel, have a seat." Nobody offered coffee, nobody made small talk. The atmosphere was ice cold. One of the attorneys slid a folder across the table. "Would you explain these approvals?" Inside were copies of financial authorizations. My electronic signature appeared on every page. 7 separate vendor payments, nearly $12 million. Every document listed my approval. Every timestamp matched business hours. Every signature looked perfect. Except, I had never signed a single one. I looked up. "These are fake." Silence. The gray-haired man finally spoke. "That's a serious claim." "I know. Can you prove it?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. "How do you prove you didn't sign something that appears to have your signature?" Richard sighed dramatically. I hoped there was another explanation. Another explanation? As if he were disappointed. As if he wanted to believe me. It was a flawless performance. If I hadn't known him, I probably would have believed it too. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Every answer I gave somehow became another question. Why had I questioned vendor contracts? Why had I refused certain approvals? Why had I requested procurement reports? Why had I contacted vendors directly? Every action I'd taken to protect the company was suddenly presented as suspicious behavior. It was brilliant, terrifying, and completely backwards. By lunchtime, I realized something horrifying. This wasn't an investigation, it was a presentation. The decision had already been made. They weren't looking for the truth, they were building a narrative, and every answer I gave was simply another brick in the wall. After the meeting, Richard stopped me outside the conference room. His voice was soft, almost sympathetic. "I can still help you." I stared at him. "Help me? If there's something you need to admit." "I didn't do anything." He nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Those words haunted me for weeks, not because of what they meant, because of how rehearsed they sounded, like he'd practiced them many times, for many audiences. I barely slept that night. Instead, I opened my laptop and began reviewing months of emails, hundreds, then thousands, searching for anything connected to those vendors. Nothing. No requests, no approvals, no discussions. It was as if $12 million had appeared from thin air. Then I noticed something strange. Several emails I clearly remembered sending were gone. Not archived, gone. Entire conversations had disappeared. Calendar invitations, meeting notes, approval requests, vanished. At first, I assumed there was a server problem. Then I checked backups. Those were missing too. Someone hadn't simply deleted emails. Someone had cleaned history. That requires access ordinary employees don't have. Friday morning, I drove to work earlier than usual, 6:15. The parking lot was almost empty. As I entered the executive floor, I heard voices coming from the boardroom. The door wasn't fully closed. Normally, I would have walked away. Instead, I stopped. Richard was speaking. "He still doesn't realize," Evelyn answered. "He won't." Another voice, one I didn't recognize. "The board only needs enough evidence to remove him." Richard laughed. "The evidence already exists." My heart started pounding. I should have walked in, demanded answers, recorded everything, done something. Instead, I froze. Because fear has an incredible ability to convince intelligent people to do absolutely nothing. A phone vibrated inside the room. Footsteps approached. I hurried away before anyone opened the door. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed another 30 seconds. That afternoon, I called Mark Benson's widow. It felt awkward. We hadn't spoken since his funeral. She sounded surprised to hear from me. After a few minutes of polite conversation, I asked about Mark's retirement. There was a long silence. Then she said something unexpected. "He didn't retire." "What?" "He resigned." My grip tightened around the phone. "He told everyone it was retirement." "I know." "He said it was safer." "Safer? What do you mean?" "He thought people were watching him." Another silence. "He became paranoid during his last 6 months." "Did he ever tell you why?" "He said..." Her voice cracked. "He said he'd discovered something that powerful people couldn't afford to let become public." Every muscle in my body went tense. "What exactly did he discover?" "I don't know." "He wouldn't tell me." "He said if I didn't know, I couldn't accidentally reveal it." Then she added one sentence that changed everything. "Before he died, he left something in a safety deposit box." My pulse exploded. "What?" "I've never opened it." We arranged to meet Sunday afternoon. The bank was quiet. Neither of us spoke much while the manager unlocked the private room. She placed a small metal box on the table. Inside, there were documents, old notebooks, several USB drives, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, in thick black handwriting, it read, "For Daniel Carter." My name, not his wife, mine. I looked at her. She looked just as confused. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Daniel, if you're reading this, then they finally came for you. Don't trust Richard. Don't trust the new CFO. Don't trust internal audit. Especially don't trust the board. They're all connected now. I wanted to expose everything. I ran out of time. The proof isn't here. It was never safe to keep in one place. But if anyone can find it, you can. One more thing. Start with the recordings." "Recordings?" I frowned. "What recordings?" That made no sense. Mark had never mentioned recording anything. Unless he wasn't talking about himself. Then I remembered something I'd completely forgotten. 2 years earlier, after a legal dispute involving another executive, our outside counsel had recommended recording executive meetings for compliance purposes. Most executives hated the idea, Richard especially. He argued it would discourage honest discussions. The compromise was simple. Official recordings would not be kept. Instead, I privately began recording meetings on my own encrypted digital recorder. Originally, it was just to help me write accurate meeting summaries. No one objected. Most people forgot I even carried it. Eventually, I forgot too. Until now. I stood frozen in that tiny bank room. Every executive meeting, every financial discussion, every strategy session. Nearly 2 years. If Richard had lied, if Evelyn had manipulated approvals, if someone had discussed those fake vendors, there was a chance, a very small chance, that I'd captured something. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt hope. Real hope. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. No one spoke. Only breathing. Slow. Calm. After several seconds, a man's voice finally whispered 5 words. "You should stop looking, Daniel." The call disconnected. At that exact moment, I noticed something through the bank's front window. A black SUV had been parked across the street since we'd arrived. Its engine was still running, and someone inside was watching us. I didn't drive home immediately. Instead, I circled the city for nearly 40 minutes. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe the black SUV belonged to someone waiting for a family member. Maybe the phone call had been nothing more than a cruel prank. But every instinct I'd developed after 12 years of managing high-stakes contracts told me otherwise. Someone wanted me to know I was being watched. And people don't waste resources watching innocent men unless they're afraid of what those men might discover. I finally pulled into my garage just after sunset. Before walking inside, I opened the storage cabinet above my workbench. Behind an old toolbox sat a small, fireproof safe. Inside was the digital recorder. It looked almost laughably ordinary, a scratched black rectangle no bigger than my hand. Nothing about it suggested it might contain the evidence capable of destroying an empire. I carried it into my home office, locked the door, and connected it to my laptop. The screen filled with folders, meeting after meeting, month after month, hundreds of hours. For a moment, I simply stared. The answer had been sitting 10 feet away from where I watched football every Sunday, hidden in plain sight. The first few recordings revealed nothing unusual. Budget discussions, hiring plans, contract negotiations, exactly what I remembered. Around midnight, I began wondering if Mark had been wrong. Maybe I'd misunderstood the note. Maybe there was nothing here. Then I opened a recording from 14 months earlier. The meeting had been about vendor consolidation. Richard sounded unusually impatient. "We're moving the payments through the new structure." Someone asked whether operations needed to approve the changes. Richard laughed. "No." Another executive hesitated. "But Daniel will ask questions." A long silence followed. Then Evelyn's voice entered the conversation. "Only until we give him the answers we want him to have." The room laughed. My stomach tightened. It wasn't evidence of fraud, but it was evidence they were intentionally keeping me in the dark. That alone changed everything. Over the next 3 days, I barely slept. Coffee replaced meals. Every recording uncovered another small piece of the puzzle. A project discussed publicly under one name appeared privately under another. Consultants mentioned during executive meetings never appeared in official documentation. Budgets shifted between departments without explanation. Nothing individually proved a crime. Together, they painted a picture of deliberate deception. Then I reached a recording dated exactly 6 weeks before my termination. The atmosphere in the room felt different from the beginning. Richard closed the meeting room door himself. No phones. Chairs moved. Someone asked if the recorder was running. Richard answered immediately. "Daniel isn't here." The room relaxed. A board member spoke next. "We've delayed this long enough." Richard replied, "We need one person. Someone operations already trusts." Another voice asked quietly, "What if Daniel refuses?" Richard didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his words made my blood run cold. "Then Daniel becomes the solution." I replayed that sentence 6 times, maybe 10. Each time it sounded even worse. There was no context explaining what the solution meant. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Weeks before the investigation began, they had already been discussing me. Not my department, not my performance, me. I exported the audio immediately, made 3 encrypted copies, stored them on separate drives. Then I called the only person outside my family I still believed I could trust, Michael Reyes, former federal prosecutor, current defense attorney. We'd met years earlier during a compliance investigation that ultimately cleared the company. He answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I heard what happened." "How?" "It reached legal circles yesterday." "Yesterday?" The company had announced my suspension less than 12 hours earlier. News was spreading remarkably fast, almost as if someone wanted it to. Michael agreed to meet before sunrise, not at his office, at a small diner nearly an hour outside the city. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything: the forged approvals, the missing emails, Mark's letter, the recordings. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he leaned forward. "Daniel, have you told anyone else?" "No." "Good." His expression hardened. "Keep it that way." I slid one of the headphones across the table. He listened to the recording mentioning me. His face changed almost instantly. When it ended, he removed the headphones very carefully. "This is important." "Enough to clear me?" "Not yet." My heart sank. He continued. "But it's enough to prove they were planning something." He paused. "And if they're planning one lie, they're probably hiding a larger one." As we left the diner, Michael stopped walking. Across the parking lot sat the same black SUV, engine running, windows tinted. He looked at me. "That's the vehicle you mentioned?" I nodded. He memorized the license plate before it slowly pulled away. Neither of us spoke until we reached our cars. Before getting inside, he handed me a small business card. On the back, he had written one sentence: "If anything happens, release everything immediately. Not tomorrow, immediately." That afternoon, I returned to the recordings. I wasn't searching randomly anymore. I built a timeline. Every suspicious payment, every executive meeting, every vendor approval, hour by hour. The pattern finally appeared. Each questionable transaction happened within 48 hours of a private executive session. The public paperwork always came later, meaning the decisions weren't being documented. They were being concealed first, then rewritten afterward. That explained the missing emails. It explained the forged signatures. It even explained why Mark had looked terrified before leaving. He hadn't stumbled across a mistake. He had uncovered a system sophisticated enough to survive audits, sophisticated enough to survive regulators. Unless someone possessed a record of what had actually been said behind closed doors, someone like me. Late that evening, my daughter knocked softly on my office door. "Dad?" I minimized everything on the screen. She smiled weakly. "Mom says you haven't eaten." I looked at the clock. It was almost 10. I lost track of time. She placed a sandwich beside my keyboard, then she hesitated. "Are we going to lose the house?" The question hit harder than any accusation. I forced a smile I didn't feel. "No." She searched my face. "You promise?" I wanted to, but I couldn't. So instead, I said the only truthful thing I had left. "I'm going to do everything I can." She hugged me before leaving. The moment the door closed, I realized this fight had stopped being about my reputation. It was about protecting the people who trusted me most. And that made me far more dangerous than Richard Harlow realized. Just after midnight, another file caught my attention. It wasn't labeled as an executive meeting, only a date. Curious, I opened it. The first 30 seconds contained nothing except muffled footsteps. Apparently, I'd switched the recorder on early. Then voices entered the hallway outside the boardroom. Richard, Evelyn, and someone else. The third voice said quietly, "If Daniel ever finds the offshore accounts." Richard interrupted him before he could finish. "He won't." The third voice wasn't convinced. "And if he already has?" Richard answered with chilling confidence. "Then he won't live long enough to prove it." Every sound in the room seemed to disappear. I replayed the sentence, again and again. There was no mistaking it. For the first time, this wasn't just corporate betrayal. This was something far darker. And at that exact moment, my security camera sent an alert to my phone. Someone was standing on my front porch. Not knocking, not leaving, just standing there, watching the house. The man standing on my front porch didn't move. He didn't knock. He didn't look at his phone. He simply stood there, watching. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door. Instead, I used the security camera microphone. "Can I help you?" The man slowly looked directly into the camera. "I'm not here to hurt you." His voice was calm. "I'm here because you're running out of time." Then he slipped a plain white envelope under the door, turned around, climbed into a dark sedan, and disappeared into the night. No threats, no explanation, nothing. I waited another 5 minutes before opening the door. The envelope contained only one flash drive and a handwritten note. "They don't know this exists. Don't waste it." No signature, no fingerprints, nothing else. I plugged the flash drive into an old laptop that had never been connected to my home network. Inside were scanned financial records, wire transfers, corporate ownership charts, bank statements. At first, they looked meaningless. Then one company name jumped off the screen. It was the same consulting company I'd questioned months earlier. Except this time, the ownership records didn't stop at a shell corporation. They continued through another company, and another, and another, until they ended at a private investment fund. One of the largest shareholders in that fund was Richard Harlow. The CEO wasn't approving fraudulent contracts. He was paying himself. I called Michael immediately. He arrived before sunrise. For nearly 3 hours, we reviewed every document, every transfer, every recording, every timestamp. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "I think I know what happened." "What?" "You were never supposed to steal $12 million. I frowned. "Then why frame me?" "Because 12 million is small." I stared at him. "Compared to what?" He turned the laptop toward me. "The real number." At the bottom of a spreadsheet, one total appeared. $487,236,811. Almost $500 million, spread across dozens of companies over nearly 6 years. The 12 million wasn't the crime. It was the distraction, the amount investigators would focus on while the real money quietly disappeared somewhere else. I hadn't been chosen because I was guilty. I'd been chosen because I was credible, the perfect person to blame. Michael contacted federal authorities through a former colleague. Not local investigators, not company lawyers, federal prosecutors. But before handing over anything, he insisted on one condition. We release everything at once. Every recording, every financial record, every backup, every encrypted copy. If even one piece disappeared, the rest would survive. For the next 48 hours, we copied files to secure servers in 3 different states. By the time Richard realized what we had, it would already be impossible to erase. Monday morning, the company announced a press conference. Richard stood confidently behind the podium. Television cameras filled the room. He looked directly into the lens. "It is with great disappointment that we confirm former executive Daniel Carter abused the trust placed in him." He never finished the sentence. The ballroom doors opened. 3 FBI agents walked inside. The room fell silent. One agent approached the stage. Another handed Richard a document. The lead agent spoke loudly enough for every microphone to capture every word. "Richard Harlow, you're under arrest." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Richard actually laughed. "There must be some misunderstanding." "There isn't." He looked toward the board. No one stood. He looked toward Evelyn. She wouldn't even meet his eyes. Then the handcuffs came out. Every camera in the room caught the exact moment his confidence disappeared. The arrests continued for weeks, not days, weeks. Federal investigators searched company offices, private homes, storage facilities, offshore accounts. Executives who had once acted untouchable suddenly hired criminal defense attorneys. Board members resigned almost overnight. Several attempted to leave the country. 2 were stopped at the airport. News networks covered the story around the clock. The company that had spent years advertising trust and security had become the biggest corporate fraud case in the industry's history. And I still hadn't told anyone about the hallway recording. Not yet. Richard eventually accepted a plea agreement, but before sentencing, his attorneys requested a private meeting with me. Michael advised against it. I went anyway. Richard looked 20 years older. The expensive suits were gone. The confidence was gone. Even his voice sounded smaller. "You won." I shook my head. "No. The truth won." He smiled bitterly. "You always were naive." I stood to leave. Then he spoke one final sentence. "It wasn't my idea." I stopped. "What wasn't?" "Framing you." Slowly, he looked toward the observation window. "The board needed someone everyone trusted." Every hair on my arm stood up. The board, not Richard. He had been the face, but someone else had been directing everything. Even now, there were people who had never been charged. Months later, federal prosecutors called me again. They had one final request. Would I testify before Congress about corporate accountability and executive fraud? I accepted. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted people to understand how easily corruption hides behind polished smiles and expensive suits. The hearing lasted nearly 6 hours. When it ended, one senator asked me a simple question. "What made you decide to record those meetings?" The room became completely silent. I smiled. I wasn't trying to catch criminals. I was trying to remember conversations accurately. A few people laughed softly. Then I added, "It turns out the truth has an excellent memory." Nearly a year passed. My reputation was restored. Every accusation against me was withdrawn. The company publicly apologized. The wrongful termination lawsuit ended with a settlement that guaranteed my family's future. Friends asked whether the money felt like justice. It didn't. Justice wasn't the check. Justice was watching my daughter walk across the stage at her college graduation without worrying whether her father was a criminal. Justice was having my wife smile again. Justice was sleeping through the night. People still ask me whether I hate Richard Harlow. The answer surprises them. I don't. Hatred gives people free space inside your mind. He doesn't deserve that anymore. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying the person who tried to ruin your life. It's building a better one after they fail. But there is one last thing almost nobody knows. 6 months after the trials ended, I received another anonymous envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping showing Richard entering federal prison. Across the top, someone had written 4 words. "One player remains hidden." There was no return address, no fingerprints, nothing. Federal investigators later confirmed something disturbing. One offshore account connected to the scheme had been emptied exactly 18 minutes before the first arrest. More than $80 million gone. No one has ever found it. No one has ever identified who authorized the transfer. Sometimes people ask if I think the mastermind was ever caught. I always give the same answer. If they were, who sent me the second envelope? And every now and then, when my phone rings from an unknown number, I let it go to voicemail. Because some stories end, and some simply wait for the next chapter.